You know, one of the unique things about the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 is, other than the miracle of the resurrection, the miracle of Jesus feeding the 5,000 is the only miracle that all four Gospels record. Isn't that interesting? All four Gospels chose to remember this one unique miracle, other than the resurrection. You know, when I was growing up, I was always taught that if the Bible says something once, then you want to pay attention to it. If it says it twice, then you probably want to remember it. But if it says it 3, 4, or multiple times, then you really want to pay attention to it. You want to memorize it, and you want to apply it to your life, because this is something that God really wants us to take note of. And the miracle of Jesus feeding the 5,000 is one of those texts. It's not just another one of Jesus' miracles. The disciples left that day knowing that something unique had just happened. They had seen Jesus raise the dead. They'd seen Jesus heal the sick. They had seen Jesus cast out demons. But something about feeding all of those men and women and children stood out to them, and they said to themselves, something really significant happened here today. This wasn't just some miracle. There was something really important about what happened here. So we know in the Gospels that at the time when Jesus fed the 5,000, Jesus had started to gain some popularity. In the northern area of Galilee, people started to hear about this character, Jesus. You know, they knew he was a radical, that he had these unusual teachings and preachings about Judaism. And people from all over Galilee were traveling to come here and see this Jesus fellow. People had started to hear that he can do miracles, so some of them wanted to not only hear him preach, but maybe they would possibly be healed by Jesus, experience or see some of his miracles. There were people that immediately took to Jesus. There were some skeptics that were doubters, and there were some that were looking for ways to refute him, to dispute his claims and his teaching, to prove him to be a false prophet and teacher. Either way, what we know in Matthew 14 is that by the time we get to the feeding of the 5,000, there was thousands of people traveling from town to town just to hear Jesus talk, just to get a glimpse of Jesus. Can you imagine the kind of stress and anxiety and exhaustion Jesus would have felt with all of those demands, with all of those crowds and mobs? It would be exhausting. But then on top of all of that, Matthew tells us that at this point, Jesus hears this horrific news. His cousin, John the Baptist, had been executed by Herod. And Jesus at this point just needs a break. And so he and his disciples get on a little boat, and they go out into the sea to get away from the crowds, the Sea of Galilee. Well, it's called the Sea of Galilee, but it's really just a big lake. At its width, it's only about 8 miles wide. At its length, it's 13 miles long. Alfred can probably confirm this measurement. But it's not a very big sea. It's a lake, okay? And so the people, they can see Jesus the whole time. They know where he's headed. And so Matthew says what they do is they follow him. And so by the time he gets to the shore, this crowd that was demanding to hear him preach, to hear him teach, to see him perform miracles, was waiting for him. Now, as a person who's a minister, I gain a lot of respect for Jesus right here. Because I'll tell you what, I love ministering to people, but I'll be honest, when I'm done, I'm done. If I'm tired and cranky, you really don't even want to be around me, because I don't have a very good poker face. I'm going to let you know I need some R&R and a little bit of space, because Chase Campbell is just done with y'all. But not Jesus, right? Jesus at that moment, even though he had earned some R&R and needed some respite and some time away, he looks at that crowd and he says, no, I'm going to sacrifice my needs for what the crowd needs. I'm going to sacrifice what would be important for me right now for what's more important, the needs of the people. And I gained so much respect for Jesus right there. And so Matthew tells us he gets off the boat, even though he's exhausted, and he begins to preach, and he begins to teach, and he heals the sick, and he just goes about doing ministry. And he does this the whole day. And before long, thousands upon thousands of people are flocking to where Jesus had ended up. Well, things were going great, but before long, the disciples, they begin to notice that it's getting late in the day, and where they had landed on the shore, they were kind of in a remote area. There wasn't, any Chick-fil-A or Willie's or Moe's or Fellini's to order a pizza. And, there are thousands of people, and they had a little problem. It's a little problem, but they knew that little problem can quickly grow out of hand. These people were going to start to get hungry, and when they get hungry, they were going to get hangry, and hangry turns into chaos, and things would quickly dissolve and turn chaotic. I don't know if you've ever dealt with hangry people, but I know from my own experience with my kids, at 6 o'clock, they're hungry, right? At 7 o'clock, they're hangry. At 8 o'clock, they're looking at our little dog Daisy thinking, you know what, she makes a nice roast. Can we just put her in the oven and just get on with the show? So the disciples, they notice that this crowd is going to start to get really hungry. And they say, hey, Jesus, listen, we need to send the crowd away because we're about 5-6 miles away from the nearest town. And the people need to buy some food. And then Jesus says something really interesting, right? He says, well, guys, I hear what you're saying, but things are going really great here. I think you guys are grown men. I think you guys can handle it. Don't send them away. You feed them. Figure it out. You guys take care of business. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing, and we're just going to move on. I'll be honest, I don't know what the disciples were thinking, but I can imagine what they started to think. Like, what, is this guy nuts? Have you ever had one of those overly demanding bosses in your life before? The just over-the-top kind of characters. I think we've all had those kind of crummy bosses that we just remember, that we cringe over, that just demanded way too much of us. Don't worry, Alfred, I'm not talking about you. You're still one of the good ones in my book. But I'm talking about one of those kinds of characters that just expects way too much of us. Expects us to be in two places at once and demands that just are unreasonable. There's a movie about Steve Jobs, the Apple guy, with Michael Fassbender. He's one of my favorite actors. And Michael Fassbender plays Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs is unveiling one of the new Mac computers, and it's about 40 minutes away from one of his big reveals. And his software guy comes and tells him, hey, Steve, the 20-second little part of the reveal that the Mac is supposed to say hello? Yeah, it doesn't work. It crashed, so don't do that. Well, Steve Jobs is just livid. He's like, what? No, this is big. You can't do that. I need this to work. Get somebody in here who can fix it. And the software guy goes, well, Steve, that guy who can fix it, it's me, and I'm telling you, I cannot fix this in 40 minutes. And Steve Jobs looks at him, he says, how long have you had to fix this problem? And he goes, I've had about 3 weeks, and it was working up until this moment, but now it doesn't work. And Steve looks at the guy and he says, the universe was created in a third of the time, and you're telling me you can't fix a computer saying hello. And I love what the guy says. He goes, well, Steve, you'll have to tell us how you did it someday, but for right now, I'm telling you the computer doesn't work. I'm not going to spoil the whole movie for you, but I will tell you this. He got the computer working. It's incredible. But Steve Jobs is just one of those examples of an overbearing, over-expecting boss that just demands too much. And I imagine the disciples were kind of feeling that way towards Jesus. Jesus, you're being ridiculous right now. You're being unreasonable. There is no way that we 12 guys could possibly feed 5,000. Actually, Matthew tells us that it was 5,000 men, not including the women and children. It was more likely that it was around 10, maybe even 15,000 people. In John's gospel, he tells us that Philip spoke up and he says, hey, Jesus, even if there were stores around here that we could buy food, we couldn't even afford to buy the food for the people. It would be thousands upon thousands of dollars, which we don't have. So what you're demanding from us is ridiculous. How can you possibly ask us to do this? So how is it that Jesus could possibly expect his disciples to feed all of these people? Well, the thing is, I think Jesus knew what he was asking was ridiculous, that it was impossible, that there was no way the disciples could ever possibly fulfill the needs of the people that day. And I think the reason why he asked them to do this was because he wanted them to feel the weight of the situation. He wanted them to know how impossible their situation truly was. He wanted them to realize that they were utterly dependent upon him, and so that they would then appreciate the miracle that was about to take place. He wanted them to see just how insufficient and fragile they were. Jesus wants us to see how insufficient and fragile we all are. You know, we don't like to admit it, but really, we're all pretty fragile, frail, weak people. That when challenges arise, we're pretty hopeless in most of our situations. We don't like to admit it. We like to think of ourselves as strong individuals who can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and get things done, that we're competent and capable. But Jesus says, no, no, you're really not. No, it's like it starts with a little cell that decides to mutate in our body. Not a big deal, right? We can handle that. It's one little cell. We've got billions of them. But then that cell splits and multiplies. And then the doctor says they don't know how to stop this splitting. And we don't know how to stop the growth. And what started out as this small little insignificant thing that we thought we could manage, that we thought we had under control, quickly gets out of hand. And we realize we're not even in control of our own bodies anymore. Or maybe it starts by losing one client. Not a big deal, right? Clients come, clients go. We'll get another one. It's not a big deal. But then the economy starts to struggle. And next thing we know, we are losing more and more clients. And some clients aren't paying their bills. And we don't even know how we're going to now pay our employees, let alone how in the world are we going to pay ourselves? And so what started out as this very manageable situation, something that we thought we had in control, quickly disseminates into something that's way out of control and impossible for us to fix. Or maybe it's a relationship. Maybe there's a spouse, a husband or wife, or a parent or a child or a sibling that we want to have a good relationship. We used to maybe have a good relationship with this person, but something happened and now that relationship is ruined and damaged. And maybe we've tried reading books and going to counseling and talking and negotiating. And maybe we've even tried yelling and screaming, but nothing seems to bring about reconciliation. And we realize just how powerless and hopeless we are to fix this situation. You see, all of us are fragile, frail human beings. We're quite hopeless when these kinds of challenges arise. You know, I'll be honest with you right now, while recording this, I feel quite helpless in my attempt to help us as a church get back together. I want us to get back together. I want it to be in a safe way. But I realize I can't do that. I'm powerless. And I'm looking to God to help me. Have you ever been in a situation like that? Well, of course you have. We all have been in situations where it feels like we're helpless, we're hopeless, that we're stacked up against impossible challenges. I want to tell you something. Christians are especially prone to facing these kinds of challenges. You might think, wait a second, shouldn't we be the exception to those kinds of things? No. We're actually more in line to face impossible challenges than unbelievers. Why is that? Very simply, when our faith is tested, when it's put through the ringer, that is when faith is strengthened. There was an interview I read not that long ago from a guy named Chris Bumstead, who was the 2017-2018 Mr. Olympia. Incredibly strong guy, right? And the interviewer asked him this very obvious question. They said, "Hey, Chris, how did you get in the shape you got in to become Mr. Olympia?" Like, he did what everybody else does, right? And I love his answer. He said, "Well, here's what I did. Every morning I woke up and I would lift really heavy weights until I was exhausted. And I'd do that for a couple hours. And I would do that until it became easier. Then I would lift heavier weights. And I made my life miserable. I never went out. I ate really bland food. I never drank any alcohol or had any sweets. I basically made my life as most challenging and difficult as you can possibly imagine. And that's how I got all of these muscles." Well, faith is a muscle. And the more that it's used, the more that it's tested, the more stress and weight that's put on it, the stronger it becomes, the more endurance it gains. We like to think that faith is simply just intellectual assent. But that's not what faith is. It's not just simply believing in something. That's part of it. Faith is belief, but it's also trust. It's also obedience. Faith is just as much a noun as it is a verb. It is active. And faith, when it is tested and tried and used, it endures. It strengthens. It develops. It grows. We don't gain strong faith by being wimpy little Christians who are isolated and held into a little bubble. And God knows that. Our faith is grown when it's put through the fire. And that's exactly what Jesus was doing with his disciples. In John's gospel, it actually tells us that Jesus said this to them because he was testing their faith. He was growing their faith. And I think sometimes God does that with us. There's a quote by Oswald Chambers, and I want to read this. He says this. He says, "Believe steadfastly on Christ, and everything that challenges you will strengthen your faith. There is a continual testing in life of faith up to the point of our physical death, which is the last great test." I want you to do something for a minute. I want you at home to think about and imagine for a moment the last great challenge you faced. The last time you felt like you were utterly hopeless, that you couldn't change your situation. Do you have it in mind? Now I want you to think about how you handled that. Did you think to yourself, I'm going to figure this out myself. I'm going to figure out my solution. I'm going to figure out how to solve my problems. Or did you think, you know what, this too shall pass. It'll work itself out. Don't worry. These are very common ways we handle very challenging situations. We either think that we can handle it ourselves, or we try to ignore the situation. Or did you turn to Jesus? Did you have a peace about it and saying, you know what, Lord, I don't know how you're going to help me or how you're going to fix this, but I know it's out of my control and out of my hands. If you didn't, if you tried to handle it yourself, or if you just simply let the situation unroll, then I want to challenge you. The next time you find yourself in a situation where you feel like your back's up against the wall, that the stacks are against you, that it's an impossible situation to get out of, I want you to say a prayer. I want you to say something like, "Dear Jesus, I'm in a situation right now that I can't get out of. This doesn't catch you by surprise. You knew I would be here. You knew I would end up here. And only you can truly get me out of this. And I want to put my faith and my trust in you." Imagine what would happen if you said a prayer like that the next time you felt like you were in an impossible situation. I don't know exactly what would happen, but here's what I do know based on the story we see in Matthew 14. I do know that Jesus would hear your prayer. Not only does Matthew 14 tell us that, but it's repeated over and over again in Scripture. When we make our supplications to God, He hears our prayers. God's going to hear your prayer. And when we make those supplications, He will not abandon us. And third, He will answer our prayers. Now, it may not be the way we imagine, it may not be the way we want it to be, but He will answer our prayers. The disciples told Jesus, "Hey, Jesus, we can't handle this situation right now." And Jesus gave them a solution. And it wasn't a solution they ever thought or imagined would be. So Matthew 17 says that Jesus had them gather up their supplies, and they had some bread and they had some fish, and He had the crowd sit in the grass. And it says that He took the bread and He blessed it, and He gave thanks, and He broke it, and He had the disciples hand it out to the people. And He did then the same with the fish. And there's an interesting line. It says that they fed until they had their fill, meaning they fed until they were full. They didn't just get a little morsel. They got as much as they wanted. And to refute any skeptic who would ever doubt, Matthew says that by the time they were done, they collected all the leftovers, and there were 12 basketfuls filled with bread and fish. And Jesus solved the problem. Jesus gave them a solution. It was an unforeseeable solution. It was something that none of them had ever thought or imagined would be the solution, but Jesus made it happen. And I love this miracle because, on one hand, this miracle shows the amazing and immense power that Jesus has. But on the other hand, it's very modest, right? There's no fireworks, there's no flashing lights, there's no angelic beings. It's just simply Jesus handing out the bread, and more bread comes out. It's Jesus taking the simple gift of bread and fish that was offered to Him and using the willing hands to pass the bread out, that this amazingly powerful miracle happens before their eyes. And you know something? That's exactly how I see Jesus working still today. I see that Jesus doesn't simply just fix our solution, but that He asks us to be part of it. He asks us to be willing, serving hands. That He takes the resources that we have and He uses that to accomplish His will. I'm here to tell you that if you're willing to give your hands, if you're willing to give your resources to Jesus, and you're in an impossible situation, that He will hear you and He will answer. Just like He did that day with 5,000. But there's one last thing to note about this miracle. The thing that I think makes it stand out above all other miracles. This miracle teaches us that Jesus is willing to be there for us when we're in a bind, but it actually teaches us something even deeper, something more significant. Jesus says there's actually a greater problem that we all face, a bigger impossible challenge that we were all born with. It's not food for the stomach, but actually all of us have a soul hunger, a hunger in our hearts that we were born with, that we can't quench without Him. Try as hard as we might with filling that void, we lack the resources, we lack the power to fill the soul hunger that we have, to fill the void in our heart. I was reading a book this past week by Ravi Zacharias called Jesus Amongst Other Gods. And in the book, he talks about how the body is made to hunger for food because it knows that there's food out there to satisfy the stomach. And how the body thirsts for water because it knows that there's something out there that will quench the thirst. And our body craves love because we know that we were made for love and to be loved. We have all of these various cravings. And the one unique thing is that every human being craves a God. It craves something to worship, It craves not only just to worship that, but to have a relationship with that God. We have a hunger within each of us. And Ravi Zacharias says, just as we hunger for food and we thirst for water and we crave love, we have this desire deep inside of us to point us to the fact that we were created to have a relationship and to worship the one true God. And Jesus, when he fed the 5,000 that day, he said, "That's me." Later on in John's gospel, Jesus would say, "I am the bread of life." And by that, what he meant is, just as food satisfies your stomach, a relationship with me satisfies your soul. And that's really why all four Gospels record the feeding of the 5,000, is because it's not just this really cool miracle that tells us that Jesus will always help us out in impossible situations, but that Jesus is the bread of life, which can quench the deep hunger we have inside all of us. And that without him, we are going to continuously hunger. We could never fill the pit in our hearts. Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher and mathematician, said that he didn't actually say this, we've re-altered his saying. It's a lot more confusing, but I like how we've simplified it. But he says, we have a God-shaped hole in our heart, and try as hard as we want to throw things at it, nothing plugs that hole except the God shape, which is the cross. It's Jesus Christ. Friends, we try to throw all kinds of things in our life to plug the deep pit in our souls. And even as believers, we later on try to replace Jesus with other things that will fill that pit. But only Jesus satisfies that hunger. Only Jesus satisfies that craving. And so if you don't know the Lord, if you don't know Jesus, or if you've been gaining this hunger, then I want to invite you to take part in the bread of life. I want to invite you to find the only way to satisfy that hunger, which is a relationship with Jesus Christ. It starts by giving yourself all to him, trusting entirely to him, and following him with your whole life. Amen.